In the summer of 1975, a low-budget thriller about a killer shark terrorizing a small beach town did something no film had ever done before. It emptied swimming pools, kept vacationers out of the ocean, and became almost overnight the single most successful motion picture ever released. 50 years later, the film's two-note musical Sting remains instantly recognizable. To people who have never even seen it, its poster remains one of the most reproduced images in cinema history, and its influence on how an entire planet perceives one of the ocean's most misunderstood predators is still being measured, debated, and in some corners, quietly regretted by the very people who made it. This is the story of how a troubled, over-budget production, shot largely on a small island off the coast of Massachusetts, became the template for the modern summer blockbuster, and of the far stranger, more complicated legacy it left behind in the real ocean, among real sharks, once the cameras finally stopped rolling. It is a story that resists easy categorization, precisely because it refuses to sit neatly in either the triumphant Hollywood origin story it is so often told as, or the cautionary environmental tale it is sometimes reduced to instead. It is, more accurately, both of those stories at once, tightly and permanently intertwined. A genuine masterclass in resourceful, constraint-driven filmmaking that reshaped an entire industry, produced by a young crew who could not possibly have anticipated the specific, measurable consequences their work would eventually have on a real population of wild animals living in the actual ocean their film was inspired by. Untangling those two threads, the cinematic triumph and the ecological reckoning, requires going back to where the story actually began, not on a film set at all, but on the page. The story begins not on a film set, but on the page, with a novel published in 1974 by a young writer whose own family had a long history along the New England coast. That novel, built around a great white shark terrorizing a fictional resort town called Amity, became an immediate bestseller, and it caught the attention of two young producers working under a major studio who optioned the film rights before the book had even reached shelves. The director eventually attached to the project was, at the time, a relatively unknown 26-year-old who had directed only one previous theatrical feature, a made-for-television thriller, and a modest road picture that had done little to establish him as a major Hollywood name. According to accounts later collected for the film's various anniversary retrospectives, the studio's first choice for director nearly derailed the entire project during an early meeting, reportedly referring to the shark in the script as a whale, a mistake serious enough that the author of the source novel insisted on someone who could tell the difference. That opening proved fortunate for the young director waiting in the wings, who had reportedly already told the producers that he would happily step in should their original choice fall through, a hopeful, half-joking request that would go on to reshape both his own career and the entire commercial logic of the film industry. Filming began in the summer of 1974 on Martha's Vineyard, a decision that would prove to be simultaneously the production's greatest creative asset and its most punishing practical obstacle. Rather than shooting on a controlled soundstage or in a studio tank, the young director insisted on filming the ocean sequences on the genuine open Atlantic, making the film the first major studio production ever shot substantially at sea. That decision introduced a level of unpredictability rarely tolerated on a major Hollywood production. Boats drifted out of camera frame between takes, unexpected weather scrapped entire days of shooting, and background sailboats occasionally wandered into shots that were supposed to depict an isolated, empty ocean. A production originally budgeted at somewhere between $3 and $4 million, with a shooting schedule intended to last a matter of weeks, stretched instead across more than 100 days, eventually ballooning to a final cost of roughly $8 million, a figure considered a significant gamble for a mid-budget thriller at the time. At the center of that mounting chaos sat the production's most notorious and most consequential problem. A set of mechanical sharks, each nicknamed Bruce after the director's own attorney, built specifically to portray the film's 25-foot great white antagonist. Special effects veteran Bob Maddy, who had previously built the giant animatronic squid for an earlier studio adventure film, constructed multiple versions of the mechanical shark, each designed to be filmed from a different angle, one built to be shown approaching from the right, another from the left, and a separate, simpler rig built solely to show the animal's dorsal fin cutting through open water without requiring the full, far more complex mechanism to be deployed. Each full-scale version reportedly measured roughly 25 feet in length and weighed well over 1,000 pounds, an enormous, cumbersome piece of practical engineering built around a pneumatic system of hoses and hydraulics never designed to withstand sustained exposure to genuine seawater. Built and tested in a freshwater tank, the pneumatically operated sharks proved catastrophically unsuited to the saltwater conditions of the open Atlantic, corroding, seizing, and malfunctioning so frequently and so unpredictably that the mechanical star of the film was, by most accounts, functional for only a small fraction of the days it was actually needed on set. Salt water worked its way into the sensitive hydraulic components almost immediately. causing the mechanism to seize entirely on some days and to behave with alarming, unpredictable violence on others, occasionally requiring extensive repair work that could stretch on for days at a time while the rest of the cast and crew waited, effectively stranded, on location. That extended, frustrating downtime became its own strange, formative chapter in the production's history, with the film's 3 lead actors spending long, idle stretches of time together on set, waiting for repairs, an enforced camaraderie that would later become the subject of its own dramatized stage play, one built specifically around imagining the conversations, tensions, and creative breakthroughs that may have unfolded among the 3 men during those very delays. What could easily have sunk the production entirely instead forced a creative reinvention that would go on to define the language of suspense filmmaking for the following half-century. Faced with a shark that simply refused to work reliably, the young director and his writers began systematically removing the animal from scene after scene, relying instead on suggestion, sound, and camera perspective to convey its presence, point-of-view shots gliding just beneath the water's surface, the legs of swimmers kicking obliviously above, and long stretches of open, empty ocean allowed to sit in unbroken silence all work together to build a mounting sense of dread precisely because the audience so rarely got a clear, sustained look at the creature actually causing it. The director has since said publicly, reflecting on the accidental nature of this now celebrated technique, that a fully functional mechanical shark would very likely have produced a considerably less successful and less frightening film than the one forced into existence by the animal's constant failures, an admission that transformed what felt at the time like a production nightmare into what film historians now regard as one of the more celebrated instances of creative constraint accidentally producing a genuinely superior piece of filmmaking. That restraint extended into the film's now legendary musical score, composed by a young composer who had previously worked with the director on his television debut and would go on to become one of his most frequent and important collaborators. Rather than composing something conventionally melodic, the composer built the film's central theme around a simple, relentless 2-note alternating pattern, deceptively minimal on paper, yet extraordinarily effective at signaling the shark's unseen approach. A musical shorthand for looming danger so powerful that it has since been referenced, parodied, and borrowed by an enormous range of films and television programs in the decades that followed. The director has credited that score as being responsible for roughly half of the film's overall impact, a claim echoed by the composer himself, who has described the collaboration as a genuine turning point for his own career, one that would eventually lead to an extraordinarily long and successful partnership between the 2 men across dozens of subsequent films. The film's human performances proved every bit as significant to its eventual success as its technical and musical innovations, anchored by 3 lead actors whose off-screen dynamic, forged largely during the long, frustrating stretches of downtime waiting for the mechanical shark to be repaired, ended up shaping some of the film's most memorable material. One veteran actor known for his brooding intensity, cast as a weathered, superstitious shark hunter, delivered what would become one of the most celebrated monologues in American cinema. A haunting account of surviving the real-life sinking of a naval vessel during the Second World War and the ensuing days spent adrift among circling sharks. That monologue, according to accounts from the production, was substantially reworked and personally refined by the actor delivering it, transforming a relatively minor plot detail in earlier drafts of the script into the emotional and thematic center of the entire film. A haunting reminder that the story's central menace, however heightened for dramatic effect, was rooted in a genuine historical horror. A separate, now iconic line of dialogue, delivered by the film's lead actor upon first glimpsing the shark's full size, was reportedly improvised entirely on set, a spontaneous moment of understated dark comedy that has since become one of the most widely quoted single lines in film history. When the film finally reached theaters in the summer of 1975, its success proved almost immediate and genuinely unprecedented in scale. It opened in several hundred theaters, an unusually wide release for the era, backed by a then-novel marketing strategy built around heavy television advertising, rather than the traditional, slower rollout most films of the period, relied upon a strategy the studio had gambled on specifically to generate the kind of immediate, nationwide word-of-mouth momentum a more conventional, city-by-city release schedule simply could not achieve. The film opened to a record-setting weekend gross, and within its first 10 days alone, had already recouped its substantially inflated production costs. Within roughly 2 months, it had become the first film in history to earn more than $100 million in North American theatrical rentals. And within less than 3 months, it had overtaken a previous era's biggest hit to become the highest-grossing film ever released in North America up to that point, a milestone that stunned an industry still generally accustomed to treating a film's opening weekend as merely a modest indicator, rather than the single most important measure of a picture's ultimate commercial fate. It would go on to hold the #1 box office position in the United States for 14 consecutive weeks, an almost unheard of run of sustained dominance, and by the end of that summer, industry surveys suggested a genuinely remarkable share of young adult moviegoers across the country had already seen the film at least once, many multiple times, turning a single summer release into something closer to a shared nationwide cultural event than an ordinary theatrical run. In the years that followed, that same wide release, heavily marketed summer strategy would become the standard template for the modern blockbuster, applied again and again to an entire generation of major studio releases that followed directly in its wake, fundamentally reshaping how the entire film industry thought about the commercial potential of a summer release, a season previously treated by the industry as a relatively low-stakes dumping ground for its weaker titles, rather than prime territory for its biggest bets. Film historians studying this shift have consistently identified this single production as the clearest, most direct point of origin for an entire subsequent era of Hollywood filmmaking, one built around the assumption that a single, sufficiently well-marketed summer release could reliably outperform an entire year's worth of more modestly promoted films combined. The film's cultural footprint extended far beyond the box office ledger, however, reshaping public perception of an animal that had, until that point, occupied a comparatively minor place in the popular imagination. Sharks had certainly been feared before 1975, but the film crystallized that fear into something considerably more specific and more culturally durable. The image of a calculating, almost vengeful predator deliberately stalking human swimmers, a portrayal social scientists studying the phenomenon would later come to describe as a genuinely measurable shift in public attitude, sometimes referred to as the broader cultural phenomenon the film set in motion. Beach attendance reportedly dipped in some coastal areas in the months following the film's release, and swimmers who had never previously given sharks a second thought before entering the ocean found themselves suddenly, viscerally aware of what might be lurking beneath the surface, an anxiety the film's marketing and iconic poster art, depicting an unsuspecting swimmer directly above a rising, open-jawed shark, deliberately amplified. That shift in public perception carried consequences that extended well beyond simple beach anxiety, and it is here that the film's legacy grows considerably more complicated and considerably more consequential for the actual animals it depicted. In the years immediately following the film's release, recreational shark fishing tournaments across the American Northeast and beyond saw a marked surge in participation, drawing anglers eager to land trophy specimens of the very species the film had so memorably vilified. Marine biologists who spent those years traveling to tournament weigh-ins to collect scientific specimens have since described watching increasingly large numbers of sharks, including great whites, hauled onto docks for photographs and prize money in the years directly following the film's release, a visible, if difficult to precisely quantify, cultural echo of the film's central hunt narrative playing out in real coastal communities up and down the eastern seaboard. One prominent shark biologist who spent the following 2 decades attending exactly these kinds of tournaments across New England to gather scientific specimens has since described the atmosphere at these events as carrying a distinct, almost celebratory quality around landing the largest possible shark, regardless of whether that particular animal had ever posed any actual threat to a human being, a dynamic he and other researchers have directly connected to the specific cultural moment the film's enormous popularity helped create. The director himself has spoken candidly and repeatedly, in interviews given across the decades since the film's release, about his own complicated feelings regarding this legacy. Reflecting years later on the film's impact, he has described a genuine, lasting sense of regret over the role the story may have played in encouraging a wave of largely unnecessary sport fishing, directed at sharks in the years following its release, going so far as to describe an almost personal unease at the thought of the animals themselves, somehow resenting what his film had helped set in motion. That sentiment has been echoed by others closely involved with the original production. The author of the source novel became, in the years following the book's publication, an outspoken advocate for shark conservation, working directly alongside marine scientists and using his platform to help correct the very fears his own story had helped popularize, a transformation. His family has continued in the decades since through dedicated marine conservation work carried out in his name, including a foundation established specifically to support ocean research and shark conservation initiatives around the world. That collective sense of responsibility, expressed so consistently and so publicly by so many of the people who actually made the film, has itself become a genuinely notable part of the broader cultural story surrounding the picture's legacy, a level of public, sustained reflection rarely seen from the creative team behind any single film, let alone one as commercially dominant as this one turned out to be. Where many blockbusters fade quietly from public conversation once their box office run concludes, This particular film has instead remained the subject of an ongoing, decades-long dialogue about its real-world consequences, kept alive not by outside critics alone, but by the sustained voluntary testimony of its own director and writer, both of whom have continued revisiting and publicly reckoning with the same central question across nearly the entire span of their subsequent careers. Whether a work of fiction, however unintentionally, can meaningfully alter the fate of a real, living species. Marine scientists, studying the broader question of exactly how much responsibility the film itself deserves for subsequent shark population declines, have notably arrived at a considerably more measured and nuanced conclusion than the popular narrative of directorial guilt might suggest. Researchers and conservation organizations examining the issue in the decades since have consistently pointed to industrial-scale commercial overfishing, driven overwhelmingly by global demand for shark fins and by extensive, largely unintentional bycatch in fisheries targeting entirely different species, as the dominant order of magnitude larger driver of global shark population decline, with recreational trophy fishing, however culturally visible, and however amplified by the film's influence, accounting for a comparatively small fraction of total shark mortality worldwide. The leadership of at least one prominent international shark conservation organization has gone so far as to describe attributing the broader global decline in shark populations primarily to the film as giving the picture considerably more credit, or blame, than the underlying evidence actually supports, arguing that the clearest, most consistently documented driver of shark population collapse remains industrial fisheries operating at a scale entirely disconnected from any single film's cultural influence. Shark biologists who lived through the tournament era firsthand have offered similarly measured assessments, noting that organized shark hunting and a broader cultural fear of the animals predated the film by years, even as they acknowledged that the movie unmistakably tapped into, and likely intensified, an existing current of public anxiety rather than manufacturing it from nothing. Government-sponsored shark culling programs and recreational shark hunting had, according to researchers who tracked these practices closely, already existed on a smaller scale well before the film's release. Evidence that the underlying cultural currents of fear and fascination the story so effectively dramatized were present in American coastal culture long before any camera ever rolled on Martha's Vineyard. What the film appears to have done, according to the most careful assessments offered by researchers who have spent entire careers studying the question, is take an existing comparatively low-level current of fear and hunting activity and dramatically amplify its visibility and its cultural legitimacy, providing both a vivid new cultural script for what shark hunting could look like and a powerful shared reference point that made the activity feel considerably more mainstream and more socially rewarded than it previously had. That distinction between direct causation and cultural amplification matters enormously for understanding the film's actual legacy. And it is a distinction the scientific community has worked increasingly hard to communicate clearly as the 50th anniversary drew renewed public attention back to the subject. A shark population already under mounting pressure from expanding industrial fishing fleets throughout the second half of the 20th century did not collapse because of a single motion picture, however culturally dominant that picture briefly became. It collapsed primarily because of a global commercial fishing industry operating at a scale the recreational tournament circuit, however energized by the film's popularity, never came close to matching. The film's real and lasting influence, most researchers now agree, lies less in any direct body count it can be shown to have caused and more in the decades of skewed public perception it helped entrench, a cultural inheritance that made it considerably harder for a generation of conservationists working in the years that followed to build the kind of broad public sympathy and political support that shark protection efforts have always depended upon. What makes the film's 50-year legacy so genuinely distinctive within the broader history of Hollywood filmmaking is the unusually direct line connecting the production itself to the modern shark conservation movement that eventually rose, in significant part, to counter the very fears the film had helped popularize. Several individuals closely involved in the original production went on to dedicate substantial portions of their subsequent careers directly to shark conservation work. The film's underwater cinematographer, an accomplished diver and filmmaker whose footage of real sharks had been used to supplement the unreliable mechanical creature during production, became a significant advocate for shark protection in the years that followed, contributing directly to the effort that eventually made a specific vulnerable shark species the first in the world to receive formal legal protection anywhere on the planet, work she pursued with the same hands-on in-water dedication that had made her underwater footage so valuable to the production in the first place. A scientific consultant who had advised the production on shark behavior went on to campaign specifically for legal protections for great white sharks in South African waters, efforts that culminated in landmark national legislation enacted in the early 1990s, a law that would go on to serve as a model subsequently adopted, in various forms, by other coastal nations around the world, a genuinely direct, traceable line running from a production consultant's on-set expertise straight through to real, binding international conservation policy decades later. Taken together, these individual stories form a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Person after person who worked closely on a film, now remembered primarily for demonizing an animal instead, spent much of the remainder of their professional life working to protect that very same species, a pattern that suggests something considerably more complicated was happening on that production than a simple, uncomplicated act of monster movie fear-mongering, an experience close enough to the real animals involved that it seems to have left a lasting, protective impression on many of the people who worked most directly alongside the footage and the science behind it. That layered, genuinely paradoxical legacy, a film that simultaneously villainized an entire species in the popular imagination, while also, indirectly and through the later work of several of its own key contributors, helping to seed the modern movement dedicated to protecting that same species, has made the 50th anniversary of the film's release something considerably more significant than a simple nostalgic celebration. Throughout 2025, that milestone was marked by an extensive, year-long program of commemorative events. A limited theatrical re-release, bringing the original film back to cinema screens for the first time in decades. A major museum exhibition dedicated to the production housed at one of the film industry's most significant institutional collections, complete with the sole surviving original mechanical shark prop displayed as one of the museum's largest and most requested single objects, and a new feature-length documentary produced with direct involvement from the original director's own production company, dedicated specifically to revisiting the story of how the film was actually made and what it has come to mean in the decades since its release. Woven throughout all of that anniversary programming has run a consistent, deliberately corrective thread, an effort, championed in no small part by people who worked on the original film themselves, to use the occasion of its 50th birthday, not merely to celebrate its considerable cinematic achievements, but to actively push back against the popular misconceptions about shark behavior the film had once helped entrench. Marine biologists and conservation organizations have used the surge of public attention surrounding the anniversary as an opportunity to highlight the genuine ongoing crisis facing shark populations worldwide, noting that more than a third of all shark species and a considerably higher share of species that spend significant time in open ocean now face a real risk of extinction according to the most recent assessments conducted by international conservation bodies, a crisis driven overwhelmingly by industrial fishing pressures that receive only a small fraction of the cultural attention devoted to the comparatively rare instances when a shark and a human being cross paths at all. There is, in the end, a certain fitting symmetry to how this particular story has unfolded across half a century. A young, largely unproven director forced by a malfunctioning machine to rely on suggestion rather than spectacle, accidentally created one of the most influential and enduring thrillers in the history of the medium, one whose success rewired the entire economic logic of the film industry for the generations that followed. That same film, born out of a genuine, deeply felt fear of the ocean's most famous predator, went on to leave behind a far more complicated and ultimately more instructive legacy than its creators could ever have anticipated, one in which the very people who helped popularize that fear spent much of the rest of their careers working, with genuine and lasting commitment to help undo it. Perhaps the most fitting way to understand this anniversary, then, is not simply as a celebration of a technical and commercial achievement, however genuinely remarkable that achievement was, but as an unusually candid, decades-long case study in how popular culture can shape, for better and for worse, the way an entire society understands the natural world, and in how the people responsible for that influence can, given enough time and enough genuine reflection, work to help correct it. 50 years after a mechanical shark refused to work in the salt water off Martha's Vineyard, the real animal that inspired it remains, in very real and measurable ways, still swimming in the wake of the film's cultural aftermath, both the fear it helped create and the conservation movement that eventually rose to answer it, two currents running side by side through the same 50 years, inseparable from each other and from the single, unlikely, over-budget production that set them both in motion.